What you did was pure, unambiguous evil.
I tried everything, but he couldn't be like me. He'd never be like me.
You killed him because he didn't fit your definition of what a Hale should be. Martin Hale, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection.
On the morning of April 3, 2019, in the quiet suburb of Crestwood, Georgia, emergency dispatch received a call that would eventually unravel one of the most disturbing cases in the state's legal history. The caller was Judge Martin Hale, a 52-year-old Superior Court judge known throughout Georgia's judicial system for his harsh sentencing, his unwavering belief in law and order, and his reputation as a man who showed no mercy to those who appeared before his bench. His voice on that call was calm, measured, almost clinical as he reported that his 9-year-old son Ethan had collapsed and was not breathing. Within minutes, paramedics arrived at the stately colonial home on Magnolia Drive, a tree-lined street where American flags hung from porches and children's bicycles rested on manicured lawns. This was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors, where crime was something that happened somewhere else, and where a respected judge raising a family seemed like the embodiment of everything the community valued. But as first responders rushed into the Hale residence that April morning, they had no idea they were walking into a scene that would expose the darkest corners of a man's soul and force an entire community to confront the monster who had been hiding behind a black robe. Inside the home, paramedics found 9-year-old Ethan Hale lying motionless on the living room floor. He was wearing his favorite blue train pajamas, the ones covered in cartoon locomotives that he wore almost every night because routine and familiarity brought him comfort in a world that often overwhelmed him. Ethan had autism spectrum disorder, and though he had never spoken a full sentence in his life, those who knew him understood that he communicated in his own way through gestures, sounds, and the pure joy that lit up his face when he lined up his toy trains in perfect order on the living room carpet. But on this morning there would be no more trains, no more routines, no more of the small moments that had defined Ethan's short life. The paramedics worked frantically to revive him, performing CPR, checking vitals, doing everything their training had prepared them to do. Judge Hale stood nearby, watching with an expression that several of the first responders would later describe as strangely detached, almost as if he were observing a scene that had nothing to do with him. When asked what had happened, the judge explained in his characteristic authoritative tone that Ethan had been having behavioral issues lately, that he had been difficult to manage, and that this morning he had suddenly collapsed, possibly from a seizure. The paramedics transported Ethan to Crestwood Memorial Hospital, where doctors in the emergency room continued resuscitation efforts. But it was already too late. At 8:47 that morning, 9-year-old Ethan Hale was pronounced dead. The initial assumption among the medical staff was that this was a tragic but explicable death, perhaps the result of an undiagnosed seizure disorder or some other medical condition that had gone undetected. Children with autism sometimes had co-occurring medical issues, and sudden unexpected death, while rare, was not unheard of. Judge Hale remained at the hospital, making phone calls, speaking with hospital administrators, conducting himself with the same composed demeanor he displayed in the courtroom. To the casual observer, he appeared to be a father in shock, processing an unimaginable loss in the only way he knew how, by retreating into the formal, controlled persona that had defined his professional life. But there were those who noticed something off about his behavior. A nurse later told investigators that the judge had seemed more concerned with making arrangements and controlling the narrative than with the fact that his son had just died. A hospital social worker reported that when she tried to offer condolences, Judge Hale had responded with a curt nod and immediately changed the subject to questions about autopsy procedures and death certificates. Before we continue with this story, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. This case is one of the most complex and disturbing I've ever covered, and your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. And please, leave a comment below telling me what your initial reaction is to what you've heard so far. Do you think there's more to this story than a tragic accident? I want to hear your thoughts as we go deeper into what really happened in the Hale household. The Crestwood Police Department was notified of Ethan's death as a matter of routine protocol. In cases involving the sudden death of a child, especially one with special needs, police are typically called to conduct a preliminary investigation to rule out any suspicious circumstances. Detective Sarah Chin, a 15-year veteran of the force who specialized in crimes against children, was assigned to what everyone expected would be a straightforward review of an unfortunate but natural death. Detective Chin arrived at the hospital and spoke briefly with Judge Hale, taking down his account of the morning's events. The judge explained that Ethan had been having an increasingly difficult time lately, that his behaviors had become more challenging, and that he had been working with therapists to address these issues. That morning, the judge said Ethan had woken up earlier than usual, around 6 o'clock, and had been agitated. Judge Hale claimed he had tried to calm his son, but Ethan had become more upset, and then suddenly, without warning, had collapsed. Detective Chin took notes, asked follow-up questions, and initially found nothing in the judge's account that raised immediate red flags. Judge Hale was, after all, one of the most prominent legal figures in the region. He had served on the bench for nearly 20 years, had presided over hundreds of cases, and had built a reputation as a man of absolute integrity when it came to the law. The idea that such a person could be anything other than a grieving father seemed almost inconceivable. But Detective Chin was thorough, and thoroughness meant conducting a complete investigation regardless of who was involved. She requested permission to visit the Hale home to document the scene where Ethan had collapsed. Judge Hale readily agreed, maintaining his cooperative and composed demeanor. He provided Chin with keys to the house and told her she was welcome to examine anything she needed to see. This openness, this apparent willingness to facilitate the investigation, seemed to further support the assumption that this was nothing more than a terrible tragedy. Detective Chin arrived at the Hale residence on Magnolia Drive later that afternoon. The house was exactly what one would expect from a successful judge's home. Well-maintained, tastefully decorated, with a kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and social status. Chin walked through the front door and immediately noted the silence. Houses where children live usually have a certain energy to them, a sense of chaos barely contained, evidence of life being lived in, toys scattered about, drawings on the refrigerator, the general disorder that comes with raising a family. But the Hale home felt different. It felt controlled, almost sterile. The living room where Ethan had collapsed was immaculate. The furniture was arranged with precision, the carpet showed vacuum lines from a recent cleaning, and everything seemed to have its designated place. Detective Chin photographed the scene, noting the position where paramedics had found Ethan, examining the surrounding area for anything that might explain what had happened. And that's when she noticed the first detail that struck her as odd. There were no toys. In a house with a 9-year-old child, in the room where that child had allegedly been playing or spending time before he collapsed, there were no toys visible anywhere. No toy trains, despite the judge's mention that Ethan loved trains. No games, no books, nothing that suggested a child's presence in this space. Chin moved through the house, documenting each room. The kitchen was spotless, with everything in its place. The dining room looked as if it had been staged for a magazine photo shoot. Upstairs, she found the master bedroom, equally pristine and impersonal. And then she found Ethan's room. The door was closed, and when Detective Chin opened it, she stepped into a space that felt like it existed in a different house entirely. Unlike the rest of the home, Ethan's room had the lived-in quality one would expect from a child's bedroom. But there was something unsettling about it. The room was small, much smaller than the master bedroom, despite the house having plenty of space. The walls were bare except for a single poster of trains. There was a twin bed with plain sheets, a small dresser, and in the corner, a cardboard box filled with toy trains and other toys, but they looked unused, still in their packaging in some cases, as if they had been purchased for appearances rather than for a child to actually play with. What struck Detective Chin most forcefully was the lock on the outside of Ethan's bedroom door. Not a typical doorknob lock that could be opened from either side, but a deadbolt installed on the outside, positioned high enough that a 9-year-old child would have no way to reach it. Chin photographed the lock, her investigative instincts now fully engaged. A lock on the outside of a child's bedroom door was not necessarily proof of abuse, but it was certainly unusual enough to warrant further investigation. Parents of children with severe autism sometimes had to take extraordinary safety measures, but something about this setup felt wrong to Chin. It felt less like a safety precaution and more like a means of confinement. Detective Chin spent several hours in the Hale home that afternoon, photographing, documenting, taking notes. She examined the bathroom, noting that it too had a lock on the outside. She looked in the refrigerator and pantry, finding them fully stocked with food, which seemed to rule out neglect in that regard. But the overall impression the house gave was one of rigid control, of a space where everything had to be exactly so, where deviation from order was not tolerated. This was not the home of a family, it was the home of a man who happened to have a family living in it, and those family members were expected to conform to his standards of perfection. Before leaving, Detective Chin spoke with several neighbors, conducting what she described as routine follow-up interviews. The neighbors were shocked by Ethan's death, expressing sympathy for Judge Hale and his wife, Catherine, who worked as a part-time librarian at the local branch. But as Chin asked more specific questions about the family, about their observations of Ethan, about any concerns they might have had. The responses began to paint a more complex picture. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Margaret Sullivan who lived 3 houses down, told Detective Chen that she rarely saw Ethan outside. In a neighborhood full of children who played in yards and rode bikes on the sidewalks, Ethan was conspicuously absent. Mrs. Sullivan said she had occasionally seen Catherine taking Ethan for walks in the evening, always the same route around the block, always at the same time, but she had never seen Judge Hale with his son. She had assumed the judge was simply busy with his demanding career, but now, thinking back on it, she realized she couldn't recall a single time when she had seen father and son together. Another neighbor, a young mother named Jennifer Park who had children around Ethan's age, mentioned that she had tried to arrange a playdate once, thinking it would be nice for Ethan to have friends. But when she had approached Catherine Hale with the suggestion, Catherine had become flustered and made excuses, saying that Ethan's schedule was very regimented and that disruptions were difficult for him. Mrs. Park had accepted this explanation at the time, understanding that children with autism often thrived on routine, but she remembered feeling that there was something sad about the interaction, as if Catherine wanted to accept the invitation but felt she couldn't. The most telling comment came from a neighbor who lived directly next door to the Hales, a man named Robert Chin who was no relation to Detective Chin but who had lived on Magnolia Drive for over 30 years. Mr. Chin told the detective that he had occasionally heard shouting coming from the Hale home, always Judge Hale's voice, never Ethan's, which made sense given that Ethan was largely nonverbal. But what disturbed Mr. Chen was the tone of the shouting. It wasn't the frustrated but ultimately loving tone of a parent dealing with a difficult child. It was harsh, angry, filled with what Mr. Chen described as contempt. He said he had considered calling someone, maybe Child Protective Services, but he had talked himself out of it. Judge Hale was a respected member of the community after all, and Mr. Chin didn't want to cause trouble based on what might just be the normal stress of parenting a special needs child. This comment would haunt Mr. Chin for the rest of his life. It would haunt many people who had seen signs but had convinced themselves that they were misinterpreting, that they were overreacting, that surely a judge, a pillar of the community, a man entrusted with determining justice for others, could not be capable of harming his own child. Detective Chin returned to the police station that evening with a growing sense that this case was not what it appeared to be. She reviewed her notes, looked at the photographs she had taken, and something kept nagging at her. The lock on the door. The absence of toys in the common areas of the house. The neighbor's observations about never seeing Judge Hale interact with his son. The shouting that Mr. Chin had heard. Individually, none of these things proved anything, but together, they formed a pattern that suggested something was deeply wrong in the Hale household. The following morning, Detective Chin attended Ethan's autopsy, which was being performed by Dr. Michael Torres, the chief medical examiner for Crestwood County. Dr. Torres was meticulous in his work, and Chin knew that if there was anything suspicious about Ethan's death, Torres would find it. The autopsy began with an external examination of Ethan's body. Dr. Torres noted that Ethan was small for his age, in the 15th percentile for height and weight for a 9-year-old boy, which was not necessarily unusual but was worth noting. He observed that Ethan appeared generally well-nourished, with no signs of acute malnutrition. But then Dr. Torres found something that made him pause. On Ethan's upper arms, he discovered bruising in various stages of healing. Some bruises were fresh, likely sustained in the day or two before his death. Others were older, fading to that yellow-green color that indicated they were perhaps a week or two old. The pattern of the bruising was consistent with grip marks, as if someone had grabbed Ethan's arms forcefully. Dr. Torres photographed the bruises, measured them, and documented their location and appearance. Children with autism sometimes engaged in self-injurious behaviors or had difficulty with coordination that led to frequent injuries, but these bruises had a distinct pattern that suggested they were inflicted by another person. The internal examination revealed more concerning findings. When Dr. Torres examined Ethan's brain, he found evidence of subdural hemorrhaging, bleeding between the brain and the skull. This type of injury was typically associated with head trauma, the kind that might result from a fall or a blow to the head. But there were no external injuries to Ethan's head, no bumps, no cuts, no visible signs of impact. This suggested that if trauma had occurred, it had been significant enough to cause internal bleeding without leaving obvious external marks. Dr. Torres also found older, healed fractures in Ethan's ribs. These were not recent injuries. They had occurred weeks or possibly months earlier and had healed on their own. But they were there, documented in the X-rays, silent testimony to previous trauma that had never been reported, never been treated by a medical professional. Rib fractures in children, especially multiple rib fractures at different stages of healing, were considered a red flag for physical abuse. They rarely occurred accidentally and were often the result of forceful compression or blows to the chest. By the time Dr. Torres completed the autopsy, the cause of death was clear. Ethan had died from blunt force trauma to the head that had caused fatal brain hemorrhaging. The manner of death was ruled a homicide. This was not a child who had suffered a sudden, unexplained medical emergency. This was a child who had been killed by someone in that house on the morning of April 3rd. Detective Chin received Dr. Torres's preliminary findings that afternoon. The moment she heard the word homicide, the entire investigation shifted. This was no longer a tragic but natural death. This was a murder, and the most likely suspect was the last person known to have been alone with the victim, Judge Martin Hale. But investigating a sitting judge, especially one as powerful and well-connected as Martin Hale, required careful planning. Chin knew that she needed more than just the autopsy findings. She needed to build an airtight case before making any accusations, because if she was wrong or if she moved too quickly and made a procedural error, Judge Hale had the resources and connections to destroy the case and potentially end her career. Chin began by obtaining search warrants for the Hale home, Judge Hale's chambers at the courthouse, and his personal electronics. She assembled a team of investigators and forensic specialists, and on the morning of April 5, 2 days after Ethan's death, they executed the search warrants. Judge Hale was at the courthouse when the search began, and when he was informed that police were searching his home and office, he immediately contacted his attorney, a high-powered criminal defense lawyer named Richard Thornton who specialized in representing clients facing serious charges. The search of the Hale home yielded significant evidence. Forensic specialists examined the living room where Ethan had been found and discovered small bloodstains on the carpet near the baseboards that had been partially cleaned but were still detectable with luminol testing. The blood was tested and matched Ethan's DNA. In Judge Hale's home office, investigators found his personal computer and immediately began analyzing its contents. What they discovered was disturbing. Judge Hale had been conducting extensive internet searches about autism, about institutionalizing children with developmental disabilities, about ways to manage difficult behaviors in autistic children. But more troubling were the search terms that suggested he was researching how to cause injury in ways that might be attributed to accidental causes or medical conditions. In the weeks before Ethan's death, Judge Hale had searched for information about head injuries in children, about how much force it took to cause internal brain bleeding, about symptoms of seizures versus symptoms of trauma. He had visited forums where he posed hypothetical questions about disciplining special needs children, always framing his questions in a way that suggested he was seeking advice for handling a challenging situation, but the underlying tone of his posts revealed a deep resentment toward his son. In one forum post made 3 weeks before Ethan's death, Judge Hale, posting under a pseudonym that investigators were able to trace back to him, had written, "How do you cope when your child is nothing like you hoped? When every day is a reminder that they'll never be normal, never be successful, never make you proud. I'm at the end of my rope." Other users on the forum had responded with support, with suggestions for therapy and respite care, with empathy for the challenges of raising a special needs child. But Judge Hale had responded to these supportive messages with increasing hostility, ultimately writing, "You don't understand. This isn't about therapy. This is about a fundamental defect that can't be fixed. Some people aren't meant to be parents to children like this." Investigators also found Judge Hale's journal, a leather-bound notebook that he kept locked in a drawer in his home office. The journal entries painted a portrait of a man who had been struggling with his son's autism since Ethan's diagnosis at age 3. The early entries showed frustration but also some attempts at acceptance. Judge Hale wrote about taking Ethan to specialists, about trying different therapies, about hoping that with the right interventions Ethan might improve. But as the years went on, the tone of the entries shifted. They became darker, more resentful, more focused on how Ethan's condition reflected on the judge himself. In one entry from 2 years before Ethan's death, Judge Hale wrote, "Attended another school meeting today about Ethan's progress or lack thereof. The teachers dance around it with their therapeutic language, but the reality is clear. My son is deficient. He will never read at grade level. He will never have friends. He will never amount to anything. And when people in the community see him, when they see me with this defective child, what do they think? They think weakness runs in the Hale family. They think I'm weak." The journal entries became increasingly disturbing as they progressed. Judge Hale wrote about his belief that Ethan's autism was somehow a personal failing, a genetic flaw that undermined everything the Hale family name represented. The Hales were a prominent family in Georgia with a history of judges, lawyers and politicians stretching back generations. Judge Hale's father had been a judge. His grandfather had been a judge. The family prided itself on a tradition of excellence, of intelligence, of contributing to society. And here was Ethan, a child who would never follow in that tradition, who would never carry on the family legacy, who existed as a living contradiction to everything Judge Hale believed made a person valuable. In an entry from 6 months before Ethan's death, Judge Hale wrote what would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him. Catherine asked me today why I don't spend more time with Ethan. She doesn't understand that every moment I spend with him is torture. Every time I look at him, I see my failure. I see a child who will never be like me, who will never achieve anything, who will be a burden on this family for the rest of his life. He can't be like me. He'll never be like me. And I don't know how much longer I can pretend that doesn't matter. That phrase, "he can't be like me," would become the defining statement of the case. It revealed everything about Judge Hale's mindset, about how he viewed his son not as a unique individual deserving of love and acceptance, but as a defective product that had failed to meet specifications. It showed that Judge Hale had been unable to separate his own ego, his own need for validation through his child's achievements, from his responsibility as a father to love and protect that child unconditionally. As the investigation continued, Detective Chen and her team interviewed people who knew the Hale family. They spoke with Ethan's teachers at Crestwood Elementary, where he attended special education classes. The teachers described Ethan as a gentle, sweet child who loved routine and structure. He had been making progress, slowly learning to communicate through a picture exchange system and sign language. His favorite activity was lining up toy trains, and his teachers had been working with him to expand his play skills and social interactions. But they also noted that they had never met Judge Hale. In 3 years of Ethan attending the school, Catherine had been the one to come to all the meetings to pick Ethan up, to communicate with the staff. Judge Hale had never once appeared at a school function, never attended a parent-teacher conference, never showed any interest in his son's education. One of Ethan's teachers, a woman named Lisa Rodriguez who had been working with autistic children for over 15 years, told investigators that she had noticed bruises on Ethan's arms on several occasions over the past year. Each time, Catherine had explained that Ethan had bumped into something or had fallen, and because children with autism sometimes had motor planning difficulties and were prone to accidents, Ms. Rodriguez had accepted these explanations. But in hindsight, she said, the pattern of injuries and the frequency with which they appeared should have raised more red flags. She expressed deep regret that she hadn't pushed harder, hadn't questioned more thoroughly, hadn't done more to protect Ethan. This was a sentiment that would be echoed by many people as the investigation unfolded. So many people had seen pieces of the puzzle. The bruises, the isolation, the father's absence from his son's life, the shouting from the house. But no one had put the pieces together soon enough to save Ethan. This is often the tragedy of child abuse cases. The signs are there, visible to those who come into contact with the child, but they remain fragmented, disconnected observations that don't coalesce into a clear picture until it's too late. Detective Chen also interviewed Catherine Hale, Ethan's mother, who had been at work at the library on the morning of Ethan's death. Catherine was a quiet woman in her late 40s, thin and nervous, with a kind of exhausted appearance that comes from years of stress. When Chen first spoke with Catherine at the library, Catherine had seemed genuinely devastated by Ethan's death. But as Chen asked more probing questions about the family dynamics, about Judge Hale's relationship with Ethan, about the discipline methods used in the home, Catherine became evasive, defensive, and eventually refused to answer questions without an attorney present. This response was telling. An innocent parent whose child had died under suspicious circumstances would typically be eager to help investigators, to provide any information that might explain what had happened. Catherine's immediate move to legal protection suggested that she knew more than she was willing to say. It suggested that she understood there were aspects of life in the Hale household that did not reflect well on her or her husband, and that she was afraid of what might be revealed. With Catherine refusing to cooperate, Detective Chen obtained a warrant to examine Catherine's cell phone and email records. What she found was heartbreaking. In the months before Ethan's death, Catherine had been sending messages to friends and family members that painted a picture of a woman trapped between her love for her son and her fear of her husband. In one email to her sister, sent 2 months before Ethan died, Catherine wrote, "I don't know what to do anymore. Martin has completely shut down when it comes to Ethan. He won't even acknowledge him most of the time. And when he does interact with Ethan, he's so harsh. I've tried talking to him about it, tried suggesting we go to counseling, but he just gets angry and tells me I'm too soft, that Ethan needs discipline and structure, not coddling. I'm terrified of what might happen, but I don't know how to stop it." In another message, this one sent just 3 weeks before Ethan's death, Catherine wrote to a friend from college, "Last night was the worst yet. Ethan had a meltdown because his routine was disrupted, and Martin lost his temper completely. He dragged Ethan to his room and locked him in there for hours. I could hear Ethan crying and stimming, and it broke my heart. When I tried to intervene, Martin told me to stay out of it, that he was teaching Ethan a lesson about controlling himself. I'm so scared. I'm scared of Martin. I'm scared for Ethan. But what can I do? Martin is a judge. He has so much power. Who would believe me if I tried to report him? And if I tried to leave with Ethan, Martin would use his connections to take custody. I feel so trapped." These messages were devastating to read. They showed that Catherine had been aware that Ethan was being abused, that she had recognized the danger, but that she had felt powerless to protect her son. Whether her fear was justified, whether Judge Hale would indeed have been able to use his position to maintain custody or avoid consequences, would be debated later. But what was clear was that Catherine had failed to protect her child. She had prioritized her own safety, her own fear of her husband's anger and power, over her son's well-being. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of many who would later learn of these messages, Catherine's inaction made her complicit in Ethan's death. As the investigation progressed, Detective Chin began interviewing people in the legal community who had worked with Judge Hale. What emerged was a portrait of a man who was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. Judge Hale had built his reputation on being tough on crime, on handing down harsh sentences, on believing that punishment was the only effective deterrent. He had presided over numerous capital murder cases and had shown no hesitation in sentencing defendants to death when he believed the evidence warranted it. He was known for his contempt for excuses, for his belief that personal responsibility was absolute, and for his intolerance of what he perceived as weakness. Several attorneys who had appeared before Judge Hale in court told investigators that he seemed to have particular disdain for defendants who came from difficult backgrounds or who had mental health issues or developmental disabilities. On multiple occasions, Judge Hale had made comments from the bench suggesting that these factors were not valid explanations for criminal behavior, that people needed to rise above their circumstances, and that society had become too permissive in making accommodations for those who were different. In one case that received significant attention, Judge Hale had sentenced a young man with documented intellectual disabilities to the maximum term for a relatively minor offense, stating in his sentencing remarks that the defendant's disability was not an excuse for failing to follow the law like everyone else. This pattern of thinking, this rigid belief in perfection and intolerance for deviation from his standard of normalcy, provided crucial context for understanding why Judge Hale had been unable to accept his own son's autism. In Judge Hale's worldview, there was no room for weakness, no excuse for falling short of expectations, no value in accommodating differences. Ethan's autism represented everything Judge Hale despised: vulnerability, dependence, deviation from the norm. And because Ethan was his son, because Ethan carried the Hale name, the child's differences felt like a personal indictment of the judge himself. One of the most revealing interviews came from a lawyer named Thomas Brennan, who had been friends with Judge Hale in law school and had remained in occasional contact over the years. Brennan told investigators about a conversation he had had with Judge Hale at a legal conference about 2 months before Ethan's death. They had been having drinks at the hotel bar, and Judge Hale, after several glasses of bourbon, had begun talking about his son. It was unusual for the judge to discuss his personal life, and Brennan had been surprised by the sudden confession. Judge Hale had described Ethan's autism, the challenges it presented, the way it had disrupted his family life. But what struck Brennan most was not the description of the difficulties. Many parents of special needs children face enormous challenges, but the absolute absence of affection in how Judge Hale spoke about his son. There was no warmth, no love, no sense that despite the difficulties Ethan mattered to his father. Instead, Judge Hale spoke about Ethan as if he were discussing a problem that needed solving, a defect that needed correcting, an embarrassment that needed to be hidden. At one point in the conversation, Brennan said, Judge Hale had leaned in close and said something that Brennan found deeply troubling. Judge Hale had said, "You know what the worst part is, Tom? It's not the autism itself. It's knowing that he'll always be this way. He can't be like me. He'll never be like me. I've sentenced hundreds of people over the years, and I've always believed that they deserved what they got because they made choices to be who they were. But Ethan never had a choice. He was born broken. And every day I have to live with this broken thing that's supposed to be my son, carrying my name, representing my family. How am I supposed to accept that?" Brennan told investigators that he had tried to offer sympathy, to suggest that perhaps Judge Hale was being too hard on himself and on Ethan, that autism didn't mean Ethan was broken, just different. But Judge Hale had waved off these attempts at reassurance with irritation. He hadn't wanted comfort or perspective. He had wanted validation for his resentment, confirmation that his anger toward his son was justified. When Brennan had been unable to provide that validation, Judge Hale had changed the subject, and they had never discussed Ethan again. Comment below if you think Catherine should face charges too, or if her fear of her husband makes her more of a victim than an accomplice. This question of how much responsibility Catherine bears for failing to protect Ethan is one that divided people as this case developed, and I want to know where you stand. After Brennan's interview, Detective Chin knew she had enough to bring charges against Judge Hale. The autopsy had established that Ethan died from homicide. The physical evidence, the bruising, the healed rib fractures, the head trauma, showed a pattern of abuse. The computer searches showed premeditation and consciousness of guilt. The journal entries revealed Judge Hale's deep resentment toward his son and his inability to accept Ethan's autism. And the statements he had made to colleagues provided evidence of motive. This was not a case of an accidental injury or a momentary loss of control. This was a case of sustained abuse that had culminated in murder. On April 10th, 1 week after Ethan's death, Detective Chin and a team of officers arrived at the courthouse to arrest Judge Martin Hale. The arrest had to be carefully coordinated. Judge Hale was still a sitting judge with enormous influence in the legal community. The decision to arrest him had gone all the way up to the state attorney general, who had determined that the evidence was sufficient to proceed. When Detective Chin walked into Judge Hale's chambers with an arrest warrant, the judge was sitting at his desk reviewing case files. He looked up at Chin with an expression of mild surprise, as if he hadn't really believed this moment would come, as if his position and power would protect him even from murder charges. Detective Chin read Judge Hale his rights and placed him under arrest for the murder of his son. Judge Hale said nothing as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He maintained his composure as he was led out of the courthouse, past colleagues and staff members who watched in shock as one of the most powerful men in Georgia's judiciary was taken into custody. The sight of Judge Hale in handcuffs, being led to a police car, was surreal for those who witnessed it. This was a man who had spent 20 years in a position of absolute authority, who had decided the fates of countless defendants, who had literally had the power of life and death in capital cases. And now he was on the other side, the accused rather than the judge, facing the same criminal justice system he had wielded so harshly against others. The arrest made national news. Media outlets across the country picked up the story. Prominent judge arrested for murdering autistic son. The case had everything that draws intense media attention. A person in power, a vulnerable victim, allegations of systematic abuse hiding behind a respectable facade. The community of Crestwood was stunned. People who had known Judge Hale professionally or socially struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the accusations against him. Some refused to believe the charges, insisting that there had to be another explanation, that perhaps Ethan's death had been accidental and the police had gotten it wrong. But others, particularly those in the autism advocacy community, seized on the case as an example of the dangerous ableism that exists even in educated, privileged families, the idea that disabled children are somehow less valuable, less deserving of life, than neurotypical children. Judge Hale was held without bond, given the severity of the charges and the concern that he might attempt to flee or use his connections to interfere with the investigation. His attorney, Richard Thornton, immediately began preparing a defense. Thornton was one of the most skilled criminal defense lawyers in the state, known for taking on difficult high-profile cases and winning them through aggressive litigation and skillful manipulation of juries. If anyone could mount a successful defense for Judge Hale, it was Thornton. The prosecution, meanwhile, was being handled by the district attorney's office, led by District Attorney Marcus Webb, a career prosecutor who had been in office for 12 years. Webb understood the significance of this case both legally and symbolically. Prosecuting a judge was rare and carried enormous political and professional risks. If Webb failed to secure a conviction, his career would likely be over. But he also understood that this case was about more than just legal strategy. It was about justice for a 9-year-old boy who had been failed by everyone who should have protected him. His father, his mother, the systems that were supposed to identify and prevent abuse. Webb decided to seek the death penalty. Under Georgia law, capital murder charges could be brought in cases involving the murder of a child under the age of 14, particularly when the murder was committed by a parent or guardian and involved evidence of torture or sustained abuse. Webb believed that the evidence in Ethan's case met these criteria. The pattern of injuries, the prolonged nature of the abuse, the premeditation evident in Judge Hale's internet searches and journal entries, all supported a charge of capital murder. The decision to seek death was controversial, even among those who believed Judge Hale was guilty. Some argued that the death penalty should be reserved for the most heinous crimes, for serial killers or terrorists, not for a father who, whatever his terrible actions, was at least partially a product of his own psychological failings and untreated issues. Others, particularly in the autism community and among child advocacy groups, argued that Judge Hale's crime was exactly the kind that warranted the ultimate punishment: the calculated, sustained abuse and murder of a defenseless child who had relied on his father for protection. The trial began in January of 2020, 9 months after Ethan's death. The courthouse in Crestwood became the center of intense media attention. Camera crews from national news networks set up outside. Protesters held vigils for Ethan, carrying signs with his photo and messages about protecting vulnerable children. Inside the courtroom, every seat was filled with journalists, legal observers, members of the community, and advocates from various disability rights organizations. Judge Hale sat at the defense table next to Richard Thornton, dressed in an expensive suit, maintaining the same composed demeanor he had always displayed on the bench. But now he was not the authority figure. Now he was the defendant, sitting where hundreds of people he had judged sat before, facing the possibility of the same harsh punishment he had so often imposed on others. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. District Attorney Webb called Dr. Michael Torres to testify about the autopsy findings. Dr. Torres explained in clinical detail the injuries Ethan had sustained, the subdural hemorrhaging that had killed him, the older rib fractures that indicated previous abuse, the bruising that showed he had been grabbed forcefully on multiple occasions. Torres testified that in his professional opinion, Ethan's injuries were inconsistent with accidental trauma or a medical event. These were injuries that had been inflicted intentionally by another person, almost certainly an adult given the force required to cause such damage. Webb then called Detective Chin to walk the jury through the investigation. Chin testified about the scene at the Hale home, about the lock on Ethan's bedroom door, about the absence of toys in the common areas, about the neighbors' observations of the family. She described the search warrants, the evidence collected from Judge Hale's computer and journal, and the pattern that emerged from all of these pieces. A father who resented his son's disability, who viewed the child as a personal failure, who had been escalating in his abuse over months and years until he finally killed the child he could not accept. The computer forensics expert testified about Judge Hale's internet searches, displaying on a screen for the jury to see the queries about head injuries, about causing trauma that might appear accidental, about managing difficult behaviors through increasingly harsh discipline. The expert explained that these searches showed a consciousness of guilt, an awareness that what Judge Hale was contemplating or doing was wrong, and an attempt to find ways to avoid detection or to make Ethan's eventual death appear to be something other than murder. When the prosecution introduced Judge Hale's journal into evidence, the courtroom went silent as excerpts were read aloud. Hearing Judge Hale's own words, the raw expression of his contempt for his son, the evolution of his resentment into something darker and more dangerous, was devastating. The jurors listened with expressions of horror and disgust as passages were read, including the entry where Judge Hale had written, "He can't be like me. He'll never be like me. And I don't know how much longer I can pretend that doesn't matter." Webb used this statement as the centerpiece of his case. He argued that it revealed Judge Hale's motive, the judge's pathological need for perfection, his inability to accept his son's autism, his belief that Ethan's differences were a personal affront to him and to the Hale family legacy. Webb told the jury that Judge Hale had spent years trying to force Ethan to be something he couldn't be, and when it became clear that Ethan would never meet his father's impossible standards, Judge Hale had decided that Ethan had no value, no right to exist. On the morning of April 3rd, Judge Hale had finally acted on that belief, killing his son in a fit of rage that was the culmination of years of abuse and resentment. The prosecution also called Ethan's teachers, his therapists, and the neighbors who had witnessed aspects of life in the Hale household. Each of these witnesses painted pieces of the picture. A sweet, vulnerable child who had been making progress in his development, who had brought joy to those who worked with him, who had deserved love and protection. And each witness also testified about the signs they had seen but not fully understood at the time. The bruises, the isolation, the fear in Catherine's eyes when she talked about her husband, the sense that something was wrong in that house even if they couldn't quite articulate what it was. One of the most emotional moments in the trial came when Lisa Rodriguez, Ethan's special education teacher, testified. Ms. Rodriguez broke down on the stand as she described Ethan's love of trains, his gentle nature, his slow but steady progress in learning to communicate. She talked about how Ethan would line up his toy trains in perfect rows, how his face would light up when he got the sequence just right, how he had been learning to use picture cards to express his wants and needs. She described a child who, despite his challenges, had been loved by his teachers and aides, who had brought something special to their lives simply by being himself. And then Ms. Rodriguez testified about the bruises she had seen on Ethan's arms, about her failure to push harder when Catherine explained them away, about her regret that she hadn't done more. She looked directly at the jury and said, "I think about Ethan every day. I think about how he trusted us, how he came to school and felt safe there, and how we sent him back to a home where he wasn't safe. I should have known. I should have done something. And I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." The defense's strategy, as outlined by Richard Thornton in his opening statement, was to argue that Ethan's death had been accidental, that Judge Hale had been trying to discipline his son on the morning of April 3rd, that Ethan had become aggressive and out of control, and that in the struggle to restrain him, Ethan had fallen and struck his head. Thornton argued that the head injury that killed Ethan was the result of this accidental fall, not an intentional act of violence. He acknowledged that Judge Hale had been a strict parent, that he had used physical discipline, but he argued that this was different from abuse, that Judge Hale had been trying to teach his son boundaries and self-control in the only way he knew how. Thornton also tried to humanize Judge Hale by calling witnesses who testified to his good character, to his years of service on the bench, to the difficulty of raising a child with severe autism. He brought in experts who testified about the stress that parents of special needs children experience, about the high rates of divorce and mental health issues in these families, about the lack of adequate support services. The implication of this testimony was clear. Judge Hale had been pushed to a breaking point by circumstances beyond his control, and while Ethan's death was tragic, it was the result of a system that had failed to provide adequate support to the family, not the result of deliberate murder. But this defense strategy ran into significant problems during cross-examination. When Webb questioned the character witnesses, he asked each of them whether they had ever been to the Hale home, whether they had ever met Ethan, whether they had any personal knowledge of Judge Hale's relationship with his son. Almost without exception, these witnesses admitted that they had not. They knew Judge Hale professionally, but they had no insight into his private life, no basis for commenting on whether he had been a good father or whether his treatment of Ethan had been appropriate. The defense's expert witnesses on parenting stress also struggled under Webb's cross-examination. Webb asked them whether the stress of parenting justified physical abuse, whether it excused causing injuries that left bruises and broken ribs, whether it explained the kind of systematic neglect and emotional rejection that the evidence showed Judge Hale had inflicted on Ethan. These experts were forced to concede that no level of stress justified abuse, that there was a clear line between strict discipline and the kind of violence that Ethan had experienced, and that nothing in the research on parenting special needs children suggested that murder was an understandable outcome of that stress. The most critical moment in the trial came when Judge Hale himself testified. Against his attorney's advice, Judge Hale insisted on taking the stand. He believed that he could persuade the jury, that his authority and intelligence would win them over, that he could explain his actions in a way that would make them understand. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. On the stand, Judge Hale displayed the same arrogance and lack of empathy that had characterized his entire relationship with Ethan. When Webb asked him to describe his son, Judge Hale's answer was cold and clinical. He talked about Ethan's diagnosis, his limitations, his behavioral challenges, but he never once expressed love or affection. He never described a single happy memory with his son, never mentioned anything that made Ethan special or unique as a person rather than as a collection of symptoms and deficits. Webb asked Judge Hale about the journal entries, about the statement that Ethan can't be like me. Judge Hale tried to explain that this statement had been taken out of context, that he had been expressing frustration in a private journal, that everyone experiences dark thoughts that they don't really mean. But Webb pressed him, "You wrote that you didn't know how much longer you could pretend that it mattered." Pretend that what mattered, Judge Hale? That your son's life mattered? That he had value as a human being? Judge Hale struggled to answer this question. He tried to redirect to talk about the challenges of parenting, but Webb wouldn't let him evade. Finally, Judge Hale said something that would become one of the defining moments of the trial. He said, "You have to understand. I spent my entire career upholding standards, expecting people to meet responsibilities, holding them accountable when they failed. And then I had a son who could never meet any standard, who could never be held accountable because he couldn't understand, who would always be dependent and limited. It was like living with a constant reminder of failure. My failure as a father. His failure as a son. The Hale family's failure to produce another generation that mattered. The courtroom was silent after this statement. Webb let the words hang in the air, let the jury absorb what Judge Hale had just said, that his son's life didn't matter because the child didn't meet his standards. Webb then asked quietly, "So what did you do with this son who, in your view, didn't matter?" Judge Hale realized too late that he had walked into a trap. He tried to backtrack to explain that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded, but the damage was done. He had revealed, in his own words, the fundamental belief that had led to Ethan's death, that some lives have value and others don't, that worth is determined by achievement and normalcy, and that those who fall short of expectations, like his autistic son, are expendable. Webb's cross-examination continued for hours, methodically dismantling Judge Hale's credibility. He walked Judge Hale through the timeline of April 3rd, pointing out the inconsistencies in his account of what had happened that morning. He confronted Judge Hale with the autopsy evidence, with the pattern of old and new injuries, with the computer searches that showed premeditation. And with each question, Judge Hale became more defensive, more evasive, more clearly the kind of hostile witness he would have destroyed if he were the one asking the questions from the bench. By the time Judge Hale left the witness stand, it was clear that his testimony had not helped his case. If anything, he had confirmed everything the prosecution had been arguing, that he was a man incapable of empathy, consumed by his own ego, who had viewed his son as a problem to be eliminated rather than a child to be loved. The defense rested its case, and the trial moved to closing arguments. Richard Thornton made a passionate appeal to the jury, arguing that while Judge Hale had been a flawed father, while he had made terrible mistakes, the evidence did not support a finding of premeditated murder. Thornton urged the jury to consider manslaughter, to recognize that Ethan's death, while tragic, had been the result of an accident in the context of a disciplinary incident that had gotten out of hand. But District Attorney Webb's closing argument was devastating in its moral clarity. He stood before the jury and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a 9-year-old boy named Ethan. Ethan loved trains. He loved routine. He loved his teachers. He was making progress every day, learning to communicate, learning to navigate a world that was often confusing and overwhelming to him. Ethan was autistic, yes, but that didn't make him less valuable. That didn't make him less deserving of love and protection. That didn't give his father the right to abuse him, to resent him, to ultimately kill him because he didn't fit the mold of what a Hale should be." Webb pointed to the empty chair where Ethan would have sat if he were alive. "Ethan can't testify in this trial. He can't tell you what his life was like in that house. He can't tell you about the fear he felt when his father grabbed him hard enough to leave bruises. He can't tell you about being locked in his room, about being treated as a burden and an embarrassment. But the evidence speaks for him. The bruises speak for him. The broken ribs speak for him. The head injury that killed him speaks for him. And Judge Hale's own words speak for him. He can't be like me. That's what this case is about. A father who couldn't accept that his son was different, and who decided that a different child had no right to live." Webb concluded by addressing the death penalty. Judge Hale sat on the bench for 20 years. He sentenced people to death. He believed in the ultimate punishment for those who committed the most heinous crimes. He showed no mercy, no compassion, no understanding for the defendants who appeared before him. And now he asks you for mercy. He asks you to believe that killing his own defenseless 9-year-old son, a child who trusted him, who depended on him for protection, somehow deserves leniency. I submit to you that if any case deserves the death penalty, it's this one. Not because of revenge, but because justice demands that we protect the most vulnerable among us. And when someone in a position of power and trust betrays that responsibility in the most fundamental way possible by murdering their own child, society must respond with its strongest condemnation. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, the community of Crestwood was gripped by tension and anticipation. Advocacy groups held vigils outside the courthouse. Media commentators debated the case endlessly. People argued about whether the death penalty was appropriate, about whether Catherine should face charges, about what lessons could be learned from this tragedy. And through it all, there was a pervasive sense of grief, not just for Ethan but for the loss of innocence that his death represented, the shattering of the illusion that prestigious families in nice neighborhoods were immune to this kind of darkness. On the 3rd day of deliberation, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread. Judge Hale was brought in, his expression carefully controlled but his tension visible in the rigid set of his shoulders. The jury filed in, and the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse, stood to deliver the verdict. In the matter of the state of Georgia versus Martin Hale, on the charge of capital murder, How do you find? We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of reactions. Some people crying, some nodding in satisfaction, some sitting in stunned silence. Judge Hale showed no visible reaction to the verdict. He sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, his face an expressionless mask. But those who were close enough to see his hands noticed that they were trembling slightly, the only sign that the verdict had affected him. The trial then moved to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Judge Hale should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The prosecution presented aggravating factors. The victim was a child, the murder was committed by a parent, there was evidence of torture and sustained abuse, and Judge Hale's position as a judge represented a profound betrayal of public trust. The defense presented mitigating factors. Judge Hale had no prior criminal record, he had served the community for years, and sentencing him to death would serve no purpose beyond revenge. The jury deliberated for 2 more days on the sentence. And when they returned, they delivered the sentence that District Attorney Webb had sought: death. Judge Martin Hale, who had sentenced numerous defendants to death during his 20 years on the bench, would now face that same fate himself. The irony was not lost on anyone in the courtroom. The judge who had shown no mercy would receive none in return. At the formal sentencing hearing, Judge Hale was given the opportunity to make a statement. His attorney advised against it, warning that anything he said would be scrutinized and could be used against him in appeals. But Judge Hale insisted. He stood before the court, the same courtroom where he had presided for so many years, and he addressed the judge who had been assigned to oversee his case, Judge Patricia Morrison, a respected jurist from a neighboring county. What Judge Hale said in that moment surprised everyone. It was not an apology. It was not an expression of remorse. Instead, it was a defense of his actions couched in language about duty and standards. He said, "I spent my career believing that society functions only when we maintain certain standards, when we hold people accountable, when we don't make excuses for failure. I applied those principles to everyone who came before my bench. And I tried to apply them to my own family. My son was not capable of meeting any standard. He would have been dependent his entire life, a burden on society, a reminder of failure. I made a decision that was logical, even if it was difficult. I don't expect mercy from this court. I never gave mercy to those who failed to meet their responsibilities, and I don't ask for it now. But I want it understood that what I did was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of pragmatism." The courtroom was stunned by this statement. Even Judge Hale's own attorney looked horrified. Judge Hale had essentially admitted that he had killed his son deliberately, that he had done so because he believed Ethan had no value, and that he saw nothing wrong with this reasoning. He had confirmed everything the prosecution had argued about his character and his motives. And in doing so, he had sealed his fate beyond any possibility of successful appeal based on mitigation. Judge Morrison, a woman known for her compassion but also for her commitment to justice, looked at Judge Hale with an expression of profound sadness and disgust. When it was her turn to speak, she said, "Mr. Hale, you spent 20 years as a judge, and in that time, you prided yourself on your toughness, on your unwillingness to accept excuses or to show mercy. You believed that strict punishment was the only way to maintain social order. And now, as you stand before this court convicted of murdering your own child, you still cling to that belief. You still try to justify your actions by invoking standards and pragmatism. But what you fail to understand is that there is no standard that justifies killing a defenseless child. There is no pragmatism in murdering your son because he didn't meet your expectations. There is only evil. Pure, unambiguous evil." Judge Morrison continued, "Ethan Hale was a 9-year-old boy. He had autism. He loved trains. He was learning to communicate. He was making progress. He brought joy to his teachers and to everyone who took the time to know him as a person rather than as a diagnosis. He deserved to live. He deserved to grow up, to experience the world in his own unique way, to be loved unconditionally by the father who was supposed to protect him. Instead, you killed him because he didn't fit your definition of what a Hale should be. You killed him because you were more concerned with your reputation and your legacy than with the life of your child. And in doing so, you committed one of the most heinous crimes I have encountered in my 30 years in the legal system." Judge Morrison looked at the packed courtroom, at the people who had come to witness justice being served. "This community, this state, entrusted you with enormous power. We gave you the authority to decide the fates of people accused of crimes, to impose sentences, to determine whether defendants lived or died. You abused that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You used your position to hide your abuse of a vulnerable child. You used your authority to intimidate anyone who might have questioned what was happening in your home. And when you finally killed your son, you believed that your status would protect you from consequences. But you were wrong. The judge then pronounced the formal sentence. Martin Hale, you are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of your son Ethan Hale. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court cannot. Judge Hale showed no reaction to the sentence. He maintained his rigid composure as he was led out of the courtroom in shackles. But as he passed through the doors, he cast one final look back at the courtroom that had been his domain for so long. In that moment, some observers later said, they saw something flicker across his face. Not remorse exactly, but perhaps a recognition that he had been wrong, that his belief in his own superiority had been the delusion that destroyed him. But if such a recognition existed, it was fleeting. Judge Hale walked out with his head held high, still clinging to the persona he had built over a lifetime, still unable or unwilling to acknowledge the full magnitude of what he had done. The aftermath of the trial brought some measure of closure but also raised difficult questions that the community continued to grapple with. Catherine Hale was charged with child endangerment and failure to protect, based on the evidence that she had known about the abuse and had done nothing to stop it. Her trial was much shorter than her husband's. The prosecution presented the text messages and emails where Catherine had expressed fear for Ethan, had acknowledged that Martin was abusing their son, but had chosen to remain silent. Catherine's defense was that she herself had been a victim of domestic abuse, that she had been terrified of her husband, and that she hadn't believed anyone would help her if she reported a respected judge. The jury in Catherine's case struggled with this defense. On one hand, they understood that victims of domestic abuse often feel trapped and powerless. On the other hand, they believed that Catherine had had opportunities to protect Ethan, that she could have gone to the police or to Child Protective Services or to family members, and that her failure to do so had contributed to Ethan's death. In the end, Catherine was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The sentence reflected the jury's belief that while Catherine bore significant responsibility for failing to protect her son, she was not the primary aggressor and had herself been victimized by Martin's controlling and abusive behavior. The case also prompted significant changes in Georgia's child protection laws. Legislators introduced bills requiring mandatory reporting of suspected abuse by a broader range of professionals, increasing funding for child protective services, and establishing better protocols for investigating abuse in families where one parent held a position of authority or public trust. Ethan's Law, as the legislation came to be known, was signed into law in 2021 and was designed to ensure that children in Georgia would have better protection, regardless of their family's social status or the positions their parents held. In the autism community, Ethan's death sparked important conversations about ableism, about the devaluation of disabled lives, and about the particular vulnerability of autistic children to abuse and neglect. Advocacy organizations used Ethan's story to highlight the need for better support services for families, for more inclusive education about autism and other developmental disabilities, and for societal recognition that all children have value regardless of their abilities or differences. Vigils were held in Ethan's memory, not just in Georgia but across the country and even internationally, as his story resonated with people who understood the dangers that come from believing that some lives are worth less than others. One of the most poignant tributes to Ethan came from his teachers at Crestwood Elementary. They created a memorial garden on the school grounds, a quiet space with a bench where Ethan used to sit during outdoor time, surrounded by flowers and a small train display. A plaque was installed with Ethan's photo and a simple inscription, "Ethan Hale. He loved trains. He loved routine. He loved life. He deserved better." The garden became a place where students and teachers could come to remember Ethan, to reflect on the importance of accepting and celebrating differences, and to recommit themselves to protecting all children, especially those who are most vulnerable. The media coverage of the trial raised broader questions about how we value human life, about what happens when parents view their children as reflections of themselves rather than as individuals with inherent worth. Op-eds and think pieces explored the particular pressure that exists in high-achieving families to produce children who meet certain standards, and what happens when those children are unable or unwilling to conform. Psychologists weighed in on the dangers of conditional love, of parenting that is based on achievement and performance rather than on unconditional acceptance. The case became a cautionary tale about the toxic effects of narcissism, about what happens when someone's need for validation and status becomes more important than the well-being of their own child. For those who had known Ethan personally, his teachers, his therapists, the aides who had worked with him, the pain of his loss was profound and lasting. Many of them struggled with guilt, questioning whether they could have done more, whether they had missed signs that should have been obvious, whether they could have saved him if they had pushed harder or questioned more insistently. Lisa Rodriguez, Ethan's teacher, left education after his death. She said in an interview that she couldn't continue in the profession knowing that she had failed to protect one of her students when it mattered most. Other professionals who worked with special needs children used Ethan's case as a learning experience, becoming more vigilant about signs of abuse, more willing to report suspicions even when they involved respected families, more committed to being advocates for children who couldn't advocate for themselves. Judge Hale was transferred to Georgia's death row at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, where he joined the approximately 40 other inmates awaiting execution in the state. In prison, Judge Hale maintained his insistence that he had done nothing wrong, that he had been convicted by a jury that didn't understand the difficult choices parents of special needs children face, that his sentence was excessive and politically motivated. He filed numerous appeals, all of which were rejected. His arguments that the trial had been unfair because of media coverage, that the jury had been biased against him, that the evidence had been insufficient, none of these arguments found traction with appellate courts. The evidence against him had been overwhelming, and his own statements, both in his journal and from the witness stand, had left no doubt about his guilt or his lack of remorse. In one of his appeals, Judge Hale's attorneys argued that sentencing him to death constituted cruel and unusual punishment because he was a first-time offender and because the death penalty should be reserved for the most heinous crimes involving multiple victims or particularly depraved circumstances. But the appellate courts rejected this argument, noting that the sustained abuse of a vulnerable child by a parent, culminating in that child's murder, absolutely constituted circumstances depraved enough to warrant the death penalty. The courts pointed to Judge Hale's own sentencing record, noting the irony that he had frequently argued for harsh sentences, including death, for defendants whose crimes were arguably less egregious than his own. As years passed, Judge Hale remained on death row, where he had ample time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. But according to those who interacted with him in prison, guards, chaplains, mental health professionals, he never truly took responsibility for what he had done. He continued to intellectualize his actions, to frame them as unfortunate but logical responses to an impossible situation. He wrote letters to legal journals and media outlets, trying to explain his perspective, trying to garner sympathy or at least understanding. But these letters only reinforced what everyone already knew, that Martin Hale was incapable of the kind of empathy and self-reflection that would allow him to genuinely comprehend the enormity of his crime. In 2023, 4 years after Ethan's death, Georgia scheduled Judge Hale's execution. As the date approached, there was renewed media attention on the case. Opponents of the death penalty argued that executing Judge Hale would not bring Ethan back, that life imprisonment would be sufficient punishment, that the state should not engage in killing even when the crime was as terrible as this one. Proponents of the execution argued that justice required it, that Judge Hale had forfeited his right to live when he killed his son, that society needed to send a clear message that the abuse and murder of children would be met with the harshest possible consequences. Ethan's extended family, his maternal grandmother, his aunts and uncles, released a statement saying that while they found no joy in the prospect of Judge Hale's execution, they believed it was the appropriate sentence. They said that Ethan had been denied any mercy by his father, that he had suffered in ways that haunted them every day, and that they could not oppose a punishment that Judge Hale himself had imposed on others throughout his career. On the evening of the scheduled execution, a small group of protesters gathered outside the prison. Some carried signs opposing the death penalty on principle. Others carried pictures of Ethan, holding vigil for a child whose life had been stolen from him. The autism advocacy community was divided on the execution. Some felt that executing Judge Hale was necessary to validate Ethan's life, to make clear that murdering a disabled child was not a lesser crime than murdering a neurotypical one. Others worried that the execution would overshadow the more important work of reforming systems and changing attitudes about disability. Inside the prison, Judge Hale was prepared for execution. He was offered the opportunity to make a final statement, a tradition in capital punishment that allows condemned prisoners to speak their last words. Most inmates use this opportunity to express remorse, to ask forgiveness from their victims' families, to make peace with God or with themselves. But Judge Hale was not most inmates. His final statement was brief and characteristic of the man he had been throughout his life. I regret that my actions have been misunderstood. I regret that the law I served faithfully has now been turned against me. I regret nothing about how I raised my son because I raised him the only way I knew how. This execution is not justice. It's revenge. And history will judge this differently than you do now. It was a stunning statement in its complete lack of remorse or self-awareness. Even in his final moments, Judge Hale could not acknowledge that he had been wrong, that he had committed an act of evil, that Ethan's death was not a misunderstanding but a murder. He went to his death still believing that he had been the victim of a system that didn't understand him, rather than the perpetrator of an unforgivable crime against his own child. The execution was carried out by lethal injection at 7 o'clock in the evening on September 15, 2023. A small group of witnesses, including District Attorney Marcus Webb, Detective Sarah Chin, and several representatives from child advocacy organizations, watched as Judge Hale was strapped to the gurney and the chemicals were administered. He died within minutes, his last moments as controlled and emotionless as he had lived much of his life. News of the execution spread quickly. Media outlets reported on the end of a case that had captivated the nation, that had forced difficult conversations about disability, about child abuse, about the particular responsibility that people in positions of authority have to model ethical behavior. Ethan's teachers gathered at the Memorial Garden at Crestwood Elementary to remember him on the night of his father's execution. They lit candles, shared stories about the sweet boy who had loved trains, and cried for the life that should have been allowed to flourish but was cut short by a father who could not see past his own ego. In the years since Ethan's death and Judge Hale's execution, his story has continued to resonate. It's taught in criminal justice courses as an example of how power and privilege can enable abuse. It's discussed in psychology classes as a case study in narcissistic personality disorder and the dangers of conditional parenting. It's referenced in disability rights advocacy as a reminder of the devaluation that disabled individuals face even within their own families. And it's remembered by everyone who knew Ethan as a tragedy that should never have happened, a preventable death that occurred because too many people saw signs but didn't act, because a community was too willing to give a judge the benefit of the doubt, because a child's life was deemed less valuable than a family's reputation. The question that haunts many people about this case is not whether Judge Hale deserved to be punished. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming and his lack of remorse was absolute, but rather how such a situation could have developed in the first place. How does a man become so warped in his thinking that he views his own child as a problem to be eliminated? How does a family dynamic deteriorate to the point where systematic abuse can continue for years without intervention? How does a community miss the signs that a child is suffering, especially when that child is as vulnerable as Ethan? The answers to these questions are complex and uncomfortable. They require us to examine our own assumptions about disability, about achievement, about what makes a life valuable. They require us to confront the ways in which we prioritize appearance and status over genuine well-being, the ways in which we defer to authority even when that authority is being abused, the ways in which we look away from suffering when it's easier than getting involved. Ethan's death forces us to ask, how many other children are suffering right now in situations that look fine from the outside? How many other families are hiding abuse behind a veneer of respectability? How many other powerful people are using their positions to shield themselves from accountability? These are not comfortable questions, but they are necessary ones. Because if Ethan's death is to mean anything, if his short life is to have any legacy beyond tragedy, it must be in prompting us to do better, to be more vigilant, to be more willing to speak up when we see signs of abuse, to be more insistent that all children, regardless of their abilities or differences, are entitled to love, protection, and the chance to live their lives free from violence and rejection. Before we close, I want to ask you to share your thoughts in the comments. This case raises so many difficult questions about parenting, about disability, about justice. Do you think the death penalty was appropriate in Judge Hale's case? Do you think Catherine's sentence was fair given her own victimization? What do you think could have been done differently to save Ethan? Your perspectives matter and I want to hear them. The Crestwood community has worked hard to heal in the years since Ethan's death, but the wound remains. Magnolia Drive looks much as it always has, tree-lined, peaceful, the kind of street where families feel safe raising children. The Hale house was sold and renovated, its dark history unknown to the new owners who moved in years later. But for those who remember, who knew Ethan or knew of him, the street will always carry a shadow. At Crestwood Elementary, Ethan's Memorial Garden has become a place of reflection and remembrance. New teachers learn about Ethan during their orientation, hear his story as a reminder of why their work matters, why vigilance is essential, why every child deserves advocates who will fight for them. Students plant flowers in the garden, add toy trains to the display, and learn about acceptance and the importance of treating everyone with kindness regardless of their differences. Detective Sarah Chin, who led the investigation into Ethan's death, has continued her work in crimes against children. She carries Ethan's photo in her case files, a reminder of why the work is important, why she can never afford to miss a sign or to give someone the benefit of the doubt when a child's safety is at stake. She has trained other investigators in recognizing patterns of abuse in high-status families, in understanding that abuse doesn't discriminate by social class or profession, in remembering that children in seemingly privileged environments can be just as vulnerable as those in poverty. Lisa Rodriguez, despite her decision to leave classroom teaching after Ethan's death, has channeled her grief into advocacy work. She speaks at conferences about child protection, about the responsibility that educators have to report suspected abuse, about the danger of assuming that respected families are immune to dysfunction. She tells Ethan's story not to seek attention or sympathy, but to ensure that his death serves as a lesson that might save other children. "I failed Ethan," she says in these presentations. "I saw the bruises. I sensed that something was wrong. But I didn't push hard enough. I didn't insist on answers. And a child died because I didn't do enough. I can't change that. But I can make sure that other teachers, other professionals who work with children, understand that gut instinct matters, that we have to be willing to ask difficult questions, that we have to be advocates for children even when it's uncomfortable." District Attorney Marcus Webb, who prosecuted the case against Judge Hale, has reflected publicly on what the case taught him about justice. In an interview several years after the trial, Webb said, "I've prosecuted hundreds of cases in my career. But the Hale case stands out because it forced me to confront my own assumptions about who commits crimes and why. I had to prosecute a man I had known professionally, a man I had respected, a man whose position in the legal system should have made him the last person capable of such a crime. But that's the lesson, isn't it? Evil doesn't announce itself. It hides behind respectability, behind achievement, behind the appearance of normalcy. And our justice system, our child protection system, all of our systems, have to be better at seeing through those appearances to identify and stop abuse before it turns deadly." The autism advocacy community has worked to ensure that Ethan's name is associated not just with his death but with efforts to improve the lives of autistic children. The Ethan Hale Foundation was established by disability rights activists to provide support services to families raising autistic children, to fund research on preventing abuse of disabled children, and to advocate for policies that recognize and protect the rights of individuals with developmental disabilities. The Foundation's mission statement reads, "Every child, regardless of ability or difference, has inherent value and dignity. Ethan Hale's life mattered. His death should never have happened. We work to ensure that his legacy is a world where all children are safe, loved, and given the opportunity to reach their potential in whatever form that takes." In the years since Judge Hale's execution, there have been periodic calls to re-examine his cases, to review the sentences he imposed during his 20 years on the bench. Several defendants who were sentenced by Judge Hale, particularly those with mental health issues or developmental disabilities, have filed appeals arguing that the bias Judge Hale demonstrated toward his own son suggests he may have been biased against defendants with similar characteristics. Some of these appeals have been successful, resulting in resentencing or new trials. This review process has been complicated and controversial, raising questions about whether Judge Hale's personal failings should impact his professional decisions, but it has also provided some measure of justice for defendants who may have been judged more harshly because of the same prejudices that led Judge Hale to abuse his son. Catherine Hale served her 15-year sentence largely in isolation. Other inmates, learning that she had failed to protect her son from abuse, made her a target. Prison officials eventually placed her in protective custody for her own safety. She has given only one interview since her conviction, a brief conversation with a local journalist in which she said, "I live every day with the knowledge that I failed my son. I was afraid of my husband, yes. But that's not an excuse. I should have been more afraid for Ethan than I was of Martin. I should have taken him and left, consequences be damned. I didn't, and Ethan paid the price for my cowardice. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. All I can do is try to encourage other parents who are in abusive situations to find the courage I didn't have, to put their children first even when it's terrifying to do so." Catherine was released from prison in 2035 after serving her full sentence. She moved to another state, changed her name, and has lived in obscurity, reportedly working in a library under her new identity. Those who have encountered her in this new life say she is a shadow of a person, someone whose guilt and grief have hollowed her out, leaving only the shell of the woman she once was. She visits Ethan's grave once a year on the anniversary of his death, a solitary figure who places toy trains on his headstone and sits in silence before leaving without a word. The question of how to remember Judge Hale himself has been contentious. Some have argued that his judicial career should be completely erased, that his name should be removed from any awards or honors he received, that no trace of his professional accomplishments should remain given the enormity of his personal crime. Others have argued that erasing his history serves no purpose, that his cases and decisions remain part of the legal record regardless of what he did to his son, and that the most appropriate response is to acknowledge both his professional competence and his personal monstrosity as a cautionary tale about the danger of separating a person's public persona from their private behavior. The Georgia Bar Association revoked Judge Hale's law license posthumously, a largely symbolic action but one that the organization felt was necessary to make clear that his actions had disqualified him from membership in the profession. The Superior Court where he served established a scholarship in Ethan's name for law students interested in child advocacy work, an attempt to create something positive from the tragedy and to ensure that Ethan's life is remembered for more than just how it ended. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to remember that this is not just a story about one judge and one child. It's a story about systems that fail, about communities that miss signs, about the particular vulnerability of disabled children, and about the consequences when parents view their children as extensions of themselves rather than as individuals with inherent worth. It's a story that forces us to examine our own beliefs about what makes a life valuable, about how we treat those who are different, about the responsibilities that come with positions of authority and trust. Ethan Hale would be 15 years old now if he had lived. He would be in high school, probably still loving trains, still finding joy in routine and order, still learning and growing in his own unique way. He might have developed more communication skills. He might have found his place in a world that is slowly, too slowly, becoming more accepting of neurodiversity. He might have become one of the many autistic adults who live fulfilling lives, who contribute to their communities, who prove that difference is not deficiency. But we will never know what Ethan might have become, because his father decided that his son's life had no value, that the embarrassment and inconvenience of raising an autistic child outweighed that child's right to exist. Judge Hale's last words claimed that history would judge his actions differently, that future generations would understand that he had been right. He was wrong about that as he was wrong about so much else. History has judged him harshly as a child murderer, as an abuser of power, as someone who betrayed every oath and responsibility that came with his position. And future generations will remember him, if they remember him at all, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing achievement over humanity, of prizing perfection over compassion, of believing that some lives matter more than others. Ethan's story ends in tragedy, but it doesn't have to end in despair. Every child who is saved because a teacher reports suspected abuse, every family that gets support before reaching a crisis point, every person who challenges their own biases about disability indifference, these are the ways in which Ethan's legacy lives on. His life mattered. His death was not in vain if we learn from it, if we do better, if we create a world where no child suffers what he suffered. The last word belongs to Ethan himself, or rather to the message that those who knew him want to share about who he was. At his memorial service, held in the same church where his parents had been married, Lisa Rodriguez read a statement that she said captured everything she wanted people to remember about her student. Ethan loved trains. He would line them up in perfect order, and when he got the sequence just right, his whole face would light up with joy. He communicated not with words but with gestures, with sounds, with the pure happiness that radiated from him when he felt safe and understood. He deserved to grow up. He deserved to experience the world in his own unique way. He deserved to be loved not despite his autism but as the complete person he was, autism and all. He deserved a father who could see past his own ego to recognize the precious gift that Ethan was. And he deserved a world that valued him not for what he could achieve but simply for being himself. We failed him. But we can honor his memory by doing better for other children like him, by fighting for a world where every child is loved, protected, and given the chance to flourish. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult story. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel to support this kind of in-depth coverage of cases that matter. And please leave a comment below with your thoughts. What is your reaction to Judge Hale's statement that he can't be like me? Do you think this case will change how we think about child abuse in privileged families? What do you think should be done to better protect vulnerable children? I want to hear from you because these conversations are how we move forward, how we ensure that tragedies like Ethan's lead to meaningful change rather than just temporary outrage. Thank you for watching, and please, if you know a child who might be in danger, speak up. Don't wait. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Be the advocate that Ethan needed and never had.